What's the second best-selling book of all time? Pilgrim's Progress. And you know, it was written from prison by John Bunyan. No, not Paul Bunyan, John Bunyan. John Bunyan was a tinker who was called by God to preach the gospel and was imprisoned for it in 17th century England. When we think of pilgrim, we often think of Bunyan's famous book, Pilgrim's Progress, but we can think of it in a different way when other Christians escaped England at the same time to America, landing on Plymouth Rock, and celebrated the first Thanksgiving. Pilgrim actually means wanderer, or a person who journeys to a holy place. And I think first of the bumper sticker that says, "All who wander are not lost." You ever seen that? God's people did a lot of wandering, and so have a lot of us. But whereas I once was lost, now I'm found. Yes. And we know that our journey will have a destination in our heavenly home with God in heaven. Now, Jacob called himself a pilgrim. And after being reunited with Joseph, his journey was nearly done. At the end of chapter 45, Joseph's brothers returned home to tell Jacob that Joseph was alive. Now, at the same time, I'm sure they confessed that 20 years earlier, they'd sold Joseph as a slave. And that's how he got to Egypt. Jacob was almost speechless. But he said in verse 28, "It is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." Now to chapter 46. As we begin our study this morning, we read in the first verse, "So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba, and offered sacrifices to God, the God of his father Isaac." Now, Beersheba was about 25 miles south of Jacob's home in Hebron. It was the southernmost town of Canaan, but Beersheba was more than just a last stop before he left the promised land. Beersheba was a special place. Decades earlier, God had spoken to Joseph here before. It was when Isaac had sent Jacob away to Laban for a wife and to escape the wrath of his brother Esau. It was at Beersheba that God told Jacob, "I am the Lord God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and your descendants. Also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread across to the west and the east, to the north and the south. And in you and in your seed, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land." And we've read in the last couple of weeks how God was with Joseph in all of his trials to lead him to where he was now. But Jacob was leaving the land that God had promised him. But God assured him that he would return to it as a great nation. It was a special place, And Jacob worshiped God here and sought his blessing. Then God spoke to Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And Jacob said, Here I am. So God said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again. And Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. Here, God repeats to Jacob the promise he'd made many years earlier. He added that Jacob would see his beloved son, Joseph. He'd see him and put his hands on his eyes before he died. Verse 5, Then Jacob arose from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob, their little ones and their wives, in the carts which Pharaoh had sent to carry them. So they took their livestock and their goods, which they had acquired in the land of Canaan, and went to Egypt. Jacob and all his descendants with him, his sons and his sons' sons, his daughters and his sons' daughters, and all his descendants he brought with him to Egypt. For Pharaoh to send wagons for Jacob and his family, it was like someone telling you, I'll send a car. This was royal treatment. Arrangements had been made by the supreme monarch of the great land of Egypt. And after traveling 25 miles from Hebron to Beersheba, Jacob's family was met by a caravan of wagons from Egypt, which brought provisions for them to make the rest of the journey. Now, the names of all Jacob's children and grandchildren may not seem important, but God included them in His Word because they enable future generations to trace their lineage to the 12 tribes of Israel. So I'm just going to read parts of the next several verses. You've tested me before on the names, and I'm not going to put you through that again. Verse 8 says, Now these were the names of the children of Israel, Jacob and his sons who went to Egypt. Now, if you will, notice there was one son who has special significance. That's Judah. Read verse 12. The sons of Judah were Onan, Shelah, Perez, and Zerah. But and Onan died in the land of Canaan. The sons of Perez were Hezron and Hamuel. Notice that one of Judah's sons was Perez, who was listed in the genealogy of Christ. In Matthew 1, verse 2, it says, Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, Jacob begot Judah and his brothers. Judah begot Perez and Terah by Tamar, and Perez begot so-and-so down to David, and then another Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called the Christ. Now, Luke 3:34 also lists Judah and Perez in the genealogy of Christ. And this fulfilled prophecy that the Messiah would come from the tribe of Judah. Genesis 49:10 says, The scepter shall not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes. A scepter is a symbol of a king's authority. The line of kings would go through David, who was a king with a scepter, to Jesus. Now, Shiloh is a Hebrew word which has two meanings. gift of God, which Christ was, and peaceful one, which Christ also was. Further, Revelations 5:5 refers to Christ as the Lion of Judah, sitting at the right hand of God and opening the seals of judgment. We'll go now to verse 26. All the persons who went with Jacob to Egypt, who came from his body besides Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were 2 persons. All the persons of the house of Jacob who went to Egypt were 70. 66 people traveled to Egypt with Joseph. And when you add Joseph, his wife, and 2 children, you get 70. 70 descendants of Jacob who would be in Egypt. Now, from these 70 people, God would make a nation of more than 2 million people in 430 years. God sent them to Goshen for 2 reasons. One is to escape the famine. The other, much more significant, is to separate them from intermarriage with the Canaanites, who had been their downfall from the beginning and would continue to be in the future. But in Goshen, they would be protected by the separation of the Nile from the other people of Egypt. It would be their own territory where they would be able to maintain their own nationality, religion, and culture. Verse 28. Then he sent Judah before him to Joseph, Jacob did, to point out before him the way to Goshen, and they came to the land of Goshen. After Jacob's 10 sons had returned from their first trip to Egypt, Joseph learned a lot about the history of his family in the past 20 years that he didn't know. But at this time, he sent Judah before them because Judah emerged as a leader in the family. He'd become a godly leader when he offered himself in Benjamin's place. Remember, Benjamin was put in prison? In Jacob's last words to his sons before he died, he recognized Judah as the leader to whom all the other sons would bow down. That's Genesis 49:8. And eventually, the tribe of Judah would become the largest of the 12 tribes. The tribe of Judah would lead the other tribes as they followed Moses through the wilderness to the promised land. They went in formations. Verse 29, so Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel, and he presented himself to him. And he fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. And Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen your face, because you are still alive. After Jacob's 10 sons had returned from their first trip to Egypt, Jacob said his grief was enough to bring down his gray hair with sorrow to the grave. That's in 44:29. Simeon was in prison at that time, and the governor wanted them to bring Benjamin. And in Genesis 42, Jacob had said to his sons, you have bereaved me. Joseph is no more, Simeon is no more, and you want to take Benjamin. All these things are against me, Jacob said. But now, seeing Joseph alive, Jacob is ready to die in peace. Verse 31, then Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh and say to him, my brothers and those of my father's house who were in the land of Canaan have come to me. And the men are shepherds, for their occupation has been to feed livestock. And they have brought their flocks, their herds, and all that they have. So it shall be, Joseph tells them, when Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? That you shall say, your servant's occupation has been with livestock. From our youth even till now, both we and also our fathers, that you may dwell in the land of Goshen. For every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. Joseph tells his brothers how he will introduce them to Pharaoh. He wants them not to lie, but to emphasize that they are herdsmen of livestock, not just shepherds of sheep, for shepherds were considered lower class in Egypt. Now we're going on into chapter 47. Then Joseph went and told Pharaoh and said, my father and my brothers, their flocks and their herds, and all that they possess, have come from the land of Canaan. And indeed, they are in the land of Goshen. And he took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to his brothers, what is your occupation? And they said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers. And they said to Pharaoh, we have come to dwell in the land because your servants have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen. Joseph had given them instruction, but as Joseph tells Pharaoh that his family has arrived, he tells them that they are keepers of flocks and herds, meaning not just sheep, but other large, useful animals that might give them more esteem. Now, the brothers didn't seem to understand the distinction and simply told Pharaoh that they were shepherds. But Pharaoh welcomes them generously and grants them land in Goshen. Verse 5. Then Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Have your father and brothers dwell in the best of the land. Let them dwell in the land of Goshen. And if you know any competent men among them, then make them chief herdsmen over my livestock. Well now, moving to a new city and being offered a prestigious job by the king, not bad. God's hand must be in this, as he reminds them several times, I am with you. Pharaoh asks if any of Joseph's brothers are especially skilled herdsmen who could look after his own livestock. And his grant of the best land in Goshen on the Nile Delta was a blessing from God. It allowed Israel to prosper and also to live separately from the Egyptians and maintain their own identity without intermarrying. Verse 7, then Joseph brought in his father Jacob and set him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, how old are you? Jacob blesses Pharaoh at the beginning and at the end of their visit, we'll read. He recognizes that God has worked through Pharaoh to promote Joseph to a position of high authority in Egypt in order to save their family from the famine. The Bible says that we should bless others, even enemies. Now, to be sure, blessing enemies and those who persecute you, as Jesus said, takes a lot of faith. But it's faith in God who is with us and has everything under control. We may not know whether he might use others, even our enemies, to bless us. After all, he's God and we're not. Just as we talked this morning, if there's vengeance to be taken, he will take it and be more effective than we will. And we won't have to be burdened with those perseverating thoughts. Now, verse 8 goes on. Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How old are you?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage." So Jacob blessed Pharaoh again and went out from before Pharaoh. Jacob calls his 130 years few and evil. They were few compared to Abraham, who lived 175 years, and Isaac, who lived 180 years. They were evil in the sense that Jacob suffered betrayal, disappointment, discouragement, and grief. His brother had hated him, and he had to flee from his homeland. His uncle Laban deceived him into working for 14 years for Rachel, the wife he really wanted. And his wives, Leah and Rachel, and their handmaids seemed to have continuous conflict. Then Rachel died young while giving birth to Benjamin. Jacob's only daughter was raped. Simeon and Levi then took cruel revenge by treachery. But Jacob refers to his life as a pilgrimage. Remember that word? His life was a wandering as God directed him to his ultimate destination in heaven. Now, we should all look at our lives as a pilgrimage. Even coming here may be part of that pilgrimage that you never imagined. But God has ministered to you here in this very place. Now, sometimes we become very worldly focused and we take our eyes off of God. But as we've been studying the book of James, I've read in chapter 4, verses 13 and 14, that we shouldn't think about where we're going and what we're going to do. In fact, he says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow, we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell and make a profit, whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, we ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will do this and that. We will live and do this or that." We shouldn't look at any earthly destination or goal for our pilgrimage. Life is a journey to an eternal home in heaven if we follow the right path. And compared to eternity, our earthly life is short, a short journey, a grain of sand on a vast beach. no matter how long we live, this world is not our home. We're just passing through. You know that song? By Jim Reeves. This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. Jacob had peace now and shared it with Pharaoh, along with a double blessing. As the patriarch of a future nation that God promised would be a blessing to the world, Jacob could freely bless his host. Now, next week, we'll continue in chapter 47 and come to the end of Jacob's life. But as we close, before I introduce some special guests, I want to ask you, do you see your life as a spiritual pilgrimage? Do you see your trials as opportunities to grow in faith so you can please God and see your Savior more clearly? Hebrews 11:1 says, faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. 10:38 says, the just shall live by faith. Do we live by faith? Now, most of us have more life behind us than we have before us. Am I right? Yes, and if we don't have assurance of heaven as our destination, as a end result of our pilgrimage, we should talk.